You
All right.
so you
Yeah, we're late, so go on, go on, go on. No, I should do the introduction first. So, greetings, everyone. Uh, my name is Hugo Stornoyolo Silva. I'm the international correspondent for España, Navarra Confidencial. And today we're back with another of our usual interviews and, well, our weekly talk program or podcast. Today we have Brian Christopher Harris, who's a history professor. Well, a history teacher, actually. He's not a professor yet, from Boston. And, well, he's also a very passionate student about religion and theology and tradition, both from a Western and an Eastern perspective. And so I thought he was the best guest to talk about tradition and perennialism, which is a topic we haven't really touched upon in this channel. So welcome, Brian.
Thanks very much. So Ugo, where are you broadcasting from again?
Well, I am broadcasting from Ecuador, although the channel and the journal they are from Spain, but we're trying to do a kind of a regional Hispanic project, both from Europe and the Americas. So we try to focus on that particular Hispanic, so to speak, because Hispanics are not only Latinos or so, identity that connects both sides of what is called Hispanidad or the Hispanosphere. So yeah, I'm actually the correspondent from for Latin America and for the Americas, because I do a lot of work with people in the US. But yeah, the channel and the newspaper and all of the important stuff is done in and from Spain.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, so good morning to you, and good evening to anybody who's watching from Spain, I suppose.
Well, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, Brian? Because, well, I tried to do a quick intro, but I think that you can explain to us way better who you are and what you do.
Oh, goodness. Well, one never knows quite where to begin. As soon as you tell one story about yourself, you're deciding not to tell other stories about yourself. And but for the purposes of our interview, yes, I'm a history teacher in training. I'm about to enter the field, and this is my semester of practicum. But in my spare time, I devote most of my reading to philosophy and theology. I've been dedicated to many different. I'm sorry. Are you getting some sound from outside?
Yeah, but don't worry. Don't worry.
All right. No, so
well, go on, continue. Don't worry.
No, good. So I mean, I've had many loves in my life, aside from lady philosophy. Certainly, I'm very inspired by the musical traditions of different civilizations, and I'm very dedicated to a particular genre of music called the sacred harp tradition, which is possibly the oldest practice tradition in the United States today, which kind of has its roots in sort of folk musical traditions and, you know, sort of English hymnody. But it has a certain connections to, you know, the tradition of Gallic psalmody and many other things. So it's one of those deep rooted things that that you'll find in North America. And some of my academic studies, you know, have been into the history of, you know, the transmission of ballads, you know, say French ballads or sort of the English and Scottish ballads, you know, from very famously profiled by, you know, known as the child ballads. And, but, you know, I've also looked at sort of the history of, you know, the transmission of that oral culture to Quebec, particularly through the work of an anthropologist called Marius Barbeau. And, you know, meanwhile, I've always been very interested in different religious, spiritual traditions. You know, I sort of grew up between two great streams of tradition, that of, you know, the Christian West, and you know, sort of the Vedic civilization. And so these that kind of, you know, sitting at the confluence of these two great traditions has made me very curious to find points of concord and also divergence, and sort of explore, you know, all the different factors and, you know, underlying just the rich variety of thought. But you know, if I were to characterize, I mean, it sounds. I know that in this postmodern era, it sounds very grandiose to say, you know, that what you're dedicated to first and foremost is the true, the good, and the beautiful. But I think that in the end, that's what it has to come to. And you know, so I'm sort of I see my life sort of as an exploration of how best to embody that and find vocation in that.
Oh, that was a great introduction. And well, it's very interesting because you talked a little bit about your musical background, in which you have explored a particular traditional school of music, and how that connects to your studies and your experiences in two different religious and traditional backgrounds, which are the Christian West and the Vedantic, the Hindu East. And so, since our topic today is going to be about tradition and perennialism, I wanted to ask you, how did you become interested in that, in the study of these traditions, in the study of the ideas behind these schools of thought and of belief?
Good. So, I mean, you know, I think existentially, the main thing is, you know, when you grow up in the modern West, and I grew up in the far West, Northern California, mainly. You know, with a spell in Utah, some time in the Northeast, and you know, little sojourns in Ireland and India. But I think most fundamentally, there's a nostalgia for roots, because you're in this sort of pervasive cultural surround where everything seems ephemeral, and you know, nothing stays, right? Everything is movement. right? It's that sort of Heraclitean flux, and so you want to find, what is it that's the ground and center, right? What can I trust in? What that will endure and sort of be fruitful. So, I was raised in the Episcopal Church, and I think I went through many phases, right? I mean, I had a skeptical phase where I was, essentially agnostic, and read many of the new atheist authors. But simultaneously, you see, it was never a simple rejection of religion as such. I sort of, I would say I esteemed, the Vedanta and, the tradition of yoga in the fullest sense as being in some way nobler and kind of, more spiritually authentic and rich than the Western tradition as I understood it at that point. So it was really through a study of the mystics of the West that I came to understand that really, there are these profound well springs that bubble up in every civilization. There's not a people, there's not a land that where wisdom, has not illumined the hearts of men. So, through that exploration, right, I sort of delved much more deeply into my own Christian roots, right, and sort of came to identify with a high Anglo-Catholicism, and also, kind of an opening onto the patristic heritage, the scholastic heritage, and, make a study of, Platonism, Thomism. So that's one dimension, but I also made some very extensive explorations of Sufism and Tibetan Buddhism with different teachers in surviving lineages, and slowly, right, I kind of developed the discernment to know the difference between, because there's a kind of pop spirituality, right, both in every organized religion and outside of all organized religion. And I wouldn't say there's nothing in it, right, but you have to reroute it. You have to find, what is it that it's drawing on, both in terms of tapping into this primordial human desire for the good and the true, and for really salvation, deliverance, right? I believe that all persons and all beings really are ordered to that. But also then, right, the mystery of, how is it that there are so many languages and dialects, as the word speaks itself into manifestation, right? And so I've been sifting through many of the great traditions, and we've come already to, I mean, as you can see, right, that word tradition can mean so many things to so many people. And I have a couple of different approaches to that. But I mean, if I were to ask you, for example, right, and I know there's that there's a very specific meaning of, like in the Spanish context, there's something called tradicionalismo, right, which is a little different. And of course, I think also of traditionalist Catholicism, and I think of tradition as sort of custom, right? And I think of traditionalism as, as they say, not the it's passing the torch, handing on the flame. It's not the worship of ashes, right? Which I think is a well-known Mahler quotation. But you know, the symbol that comes first to me is that of sort of an organic growth from roots, that isn't merely an imitation, that isn't an attempt to kind of take your concept of it and then just superimpose it on your lived reality, but something that arises you know, authentically, organically within your own experience, right? And kind of orients you in everything you do. But I mean, what would you say if I were to say, when you speak of tradition?
Well, you see, the thing about tradition and tradicionalismo in the Spanish-speaking countries is that it's very close to what the called integralism or integrism, which you know is kind of a heavily political doctrine which incorporates Christian beliefs into its own political formulas and ideologies. And so in the Spanish-speaking countries, yeah, of course, there's some kind of political traditionalism, which you can find in for example, the Cristeros in Mexico or the Carlistas in Spain, and so on and so forth. In my country, in Ecuador, we have this kind of traditionalist statesman called Gabriel Garcia Moreno, who was a very integrist Catholic back then. But right now, we don't have this kind of influence because, you know, we live in a liberal secularist world. But still, there are some influences in which you can find even in liberal and libertarian authors, which are becoming widely influent in my region. And so, well, you talked about the organic development of societies and of experiences, and I immediately thought of Friedrich Hayek, of the Austrian economist. And there's a book of his which I really like, called Law, Legislation, and Liberty, in which he actually talks about concepts of tradition, but in the framework of the spontaneous order. And so he actually understands tradition in a very utilitarian way, by the way, as some kind of useful knowledge that you get from previous experiences or from your ancestors, and which help you to understand the world around you and not to make the same mistakes that they did. It's kind of the useful knowledge from the past. And that's tradition for Hayek. And yes, in a non-religious context, it's a very well way to understand what tradition is. But there's something more essential, more transcendental to tradition. And well, you talked a lot about the good, the true, the beautiful. And this is something that, especially as the world progresses, and there's something that we can see, especially in my region, which is becoming more and more secularized, we're forgetting about these elements, these transcendentals. So we don't no longer understand what's good or what's beautiful or what's true. And I think that's something that's happening in your country and in the Anglosphere as well.
Oh, definitely. And you know, I don't want to belabor it because it's kind of, you know, such a truism, but I think the standard understanding, you know, the average person thinks of tradition as kind of custom, or, you know, things we do, just the way that it really just means conventional, right? To say something's traditional. And then it's like in my educator training, they say, you know, it's always like, so here's the traditional method and here's why it's wrong. Isn't that awful, guys? Let's do this new thing, whatever it is, right? It's just, you know, it's always like, it's presented in that polemical way, right? To kind of, it has this implication of being static and dead and musty and kind of wrong-headed, really. You know, and I think there's this common conception you know, it almost like think of yourself as, well, you know, we have a certain contempt for the past, for our own ancestors, but even just for we imagine, you know, we hear about all of the atrocities and cruelty, which is very real, and we hear about, you know, really the, you know, think of I think this is Stephen Dedalus in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, right? That history is a nightmare from which we are struggling to awaken. And in many ways, it reminds me, of course, of Marx's evocation, right, of sort of it, you know, man doesn't make history as he will, right, in the, you know, his 18th Brumaire of Louis Napoleon, but it kind of, like it weighs like a nightmare on the brain of the living. So I think that in many ways, now, of course, we can speak in another sense, right? There is also a liberal tradition. There is also a socialist tradition, as it were. There's a conservative tradition, you know. But I think many people would assume that, you know, there's this. It's just this kind of accretion of kind of tired old ways that we've done things, and so it kind of there's this demand. We must make them submit to reason. We must we must. I think somebody like Roger Scruton, right, would kind of make it like, it's like, you want to understand the plant, and so you rip it out of the ground, right, and that you know, it's like, let's learn everything we can about its root system. Oh, it's dead. Oh, I guess we don't, you know. And then so let's reinvent ourselves. I'm thinking, I know I'm kind of ranging all over the place, but you know, I don't know if you've ever read anything by Rémi Brague, the French philosopher.
Well, I think I have read something about or by him, but I cannot really recall. I was thinking more about John Gray's criticism of the myth of progress, what he calls, yeah, all of the liberals and all of the moderns think that we're doing better off than before, but at what cost? What are we sacrificing in order to be better? And so, well, I think there's a lot of his books. I think one that particularly struck me was called The Black Mass, in which he talked about the whole, most societies have some kind of apocalyptic myth that actually is their end game, so to speak. And that, yeah, there's always this kind of myth of progress. We're going to be better in the future, and we are better than we were in the past. But when you look at history, you see that maybe all periods of history and all of the understandings of societies were pretty much the same. Right now we're bad, but we're going to be better next time, and we are way better than we were before. And so there's this kind of contempt for history and for tradition. But on the other side, there's a tradition being in having contempt for tradition. It's some kind of paradox in which people try to break from their past, but they make it, they repeat it as they're making the same mistakes all over again. And so tradition, in a sense, is kind of the cure for that kind of belief.
Right, and yeah, and I wouldn't necessarily at this stage, right, you know, that I wouldn't take for granted, in a sense, you know, that people who have a misconception of tradition, right, that they're individually culpable in that sense, right? I mean, they're just absorbing through osmosis, you know, kind of the spirit of the age, right? Of course, there was a great there's a great British you know, philosopher and theologian called William Ralph Inge. You know, he was the dean of St. Paul's in London, I believe, and he was known as the gloomy dean, right? but he was a great Christian Platonist. But he's the source of the oft quoted, it's put different ways, but like the church that marries the spirit of the age will be a widow in the next, right? Or you can even just say that the man that marries the spirit of the age. But so let's see. So it's funny because so we've received, in a sense, because of just right, we're always just as we receive our language and our concepts and everything that we have from beyond us, right? From culture, from civilization, from if you wanted to be more reductive about it, you would say conditioning, right? But so we're conditioned to be anti-traditional by you may or may not agree with it. I see it as intrinsic to the capitalist mode of production in many ways, except where it's checked by kind of the inheritance of what is pre-capitalist, right? But kind of there's so this whole kind of and I'm just sort of trying to think of where to begin, because it's all interconnected, it's all mutually entangled, right? We think that in a sense, let's see, knowledge is and must be kind of democratic and out in the open, and everything must be intelligible commonly, which there's a legitimacy to that demand. I don't but in a sense, we think that well, I'm sorry, let me go back to you because you brought up progress and modernity, and as you say, many thinkers have questioned the notion of progress, right? And that's not even thinkers on the left, on the right, and the center. Everyone, I don't know if there's one author, Christopher Lasch, who wrote about his analysis of progress, very much a man of the left who became increasing, like myself, actually. I may as well come in and say that I am a former Marxist. I was very, I would have identified myself in that way some years back, and that's been a whole something that I hesitate to use the metaphor of evolution here, because I don't think it was a blind it wasn't but I think just as the intelligence bounds and rebounds, seeking the higher and the greater, and I increasingly became skeptical of these kinds of ideological constructs and their projects. And that is kind of the crux. So according to Bragg, right, like what distinguishes modernity in some ways, what he calls the modern project, right? It's kind of like it's this distinction he draws between a task and a project. A task is entrusted to us, right? We don't have kind of a mass. We don't have a mastery over it in the sense that we can't dominate it. Rather, we can't manipulate it, right? We can't submit it to our technical grasp, right? It's sort of entrusted to us from beyond us, and so we have a duty, we have a responsibility to fulfill that task. Whereas the project is essentially this drive to be free of all constraint, right? To be free of all kind of that sense of obligation, or we have this sense, right? Man is born free, but he is everywhere in chains, right? And so the liberationist project of modernity would be to you dispense with them, as much as is possible, and create a free individual who can be totally self-defining, right? Who can everything is freely willed, everything is customizable, everything and so I think the very unpopular answer, and I would say, by the way, it's not, in a sense, it's political, but I think it comes out of a pre-political. All politics come out of the pre-political in some way, some existential concern that you're trying to address at the political level, whether or not there really is I'm increasingly despairing of any political solution to the kind of the contradictions that we're not that one shouldn't engage in politics. Of course one should, but I think that contradiction can't be resolved only at a political plane. It's always before that. But the answer that I think is widely unpopular, there are people who've tried to kind of inhabit it, in an authentic way, is we're born in chains, and it is good that it should be so, right? Like, in a sense, because those bonds are constitutive of us, right? We are not only disembodied minds, right? We have our affections, we have our loyalties, we have our roots, we have we are finite beings, right? Always embedded in a context that exceeds us, but we have also that longing for the infinite. We feel the constraint of it, but we long to transcend it in some way. And so I think it's much easier to sort of say, therefore, I must kind of rebel against all of that and seek to satisfy that longing for the infinite, the perfect, the absolute, in the realm of contingency. If I could just shatter all the walls and the ceiling, right, then I could be free. But to make peace with it, and to find freedom in a more profound sense, I think is something that regardless of what people say, it doesn't matter in a way what people say, what kind of, there's always a perennial return to the center. It's always possible to find that.
Well, and yeah, I get your point, because in modernity, people they try to break free from the past, from tradition, from all experiences that they think that are kind of conditioning them to understand and to worship and to live in a particular way. But still, they struggle. They try to find some way to get access to understand the transcendentals, to understand beauty, to understand goodness, and so on and so forth. And the thing is that many people they feel lost in modernity, because there's no sense of community, even in politics. You see there's all of these different doctrines and ideologies and political formulas, and they try to create utopias in the world, but only if you follow their particular formula. You see that Eric Vogelin, he said that this was some kind of a political Gnosticism, and he actually made a genealogy of the way Marxism, communism were actually descended from Gnostic thought. It's another topic. And well, you see that in the West, at least, there's some kind of interest for Eastern doctrines, because people still try to have a sense of worshiping and of community, because you see that the word culture actually means it's descended from cult, and cult means to worship, a religion, and believe. And so people who are pretty much atomized and they are lonely and so on and so forth, they try to understand, they try to get some kind of belief that fits their own personal circumstances. And so there's this kind of pop tradition and pop religion that pops every now and then in the West, and maybe sometimes it has a deeper spiritual meaning, like the diffusion, like the defunding Alan Watts made back in the 60s and 70s, which has a very interesting background. Actually, he was well studied into Buddhist and Hinduist traditions, and well, most people wouldn't know about perennialism or Ananda Kumaraswamy or about René Guénon if they haven't listened to Alan Watts first. But still, people in the West, they try to get to a point that they understand what the transcendentals are, but they don't want to practice or to be bound by any religion or by any doctrine or tradition. The best one they can find is somewhat of a political ideology, and they actually worship that ideology. They become very radical and very, well, how do I put this? They become actually religious fanatics, but instead of religion, they use politics as their fanaticism. And this is a problem that I'm seeing in the West very much right now, because people want to worship, want to believe in something, but they are not going to try to go back to religion or to go back to tradition. They don't want to, because that's the way we're wired in. Our tradition is preventing us from going back to the tradition.
Definitely. Another resource I would really recommend, if you know the Thomistic philosopher, I say Thomistic, but he's also deeply Platonic, Josef Pieper. He wrote just a wonderful short book on tradition that I think is just called Tradition, with a subtitle like, concept and definition or something along those lines. But essentially what he comes to is that, the core of tradition, really, ultimately tradition is sacred tradition if it is not only custom. And that is also, I would say, the understanding of, you invoked René Guénon, Ananda Kumaraswamy, right? For them, tradition is really a transmission of the divine into human existence, right? And it's a mediated transmission, right? There are sages, prophets, right, through whom the divine makes itself known, right? And it's not something super added to civilization, right? It's not like, we just had this purely material existence and then we became religious. They would say no. Whether or not it's explicit, right? The animating core of every civilization is the sacred, right? And the thing is, right, it becomes explicit, we would think, maybe late in history, but that's because, usually, right, when something is being put down into writing, it's for fear of losing it, right? Prior to that, it's sort of, you feel it, not just feel it, but in a sense, it's so evident that it needn't be made explicit, but there's kind of an understanding. There's a way of being. There's just kind of a pervasive orienting principle. But then every time there's a fear that what is being received from the living transmission of the divine into a civilization, when it's fear that it's lost, then it's put down, then it's recorded and systematized, and right. But that doesn't mean, in a sense, that later figures are more advanced per se, right? The explicitude. I mean, it just we need those scaffolds. We need that because of our increasing distance from the source, right? Those things can help us, God willing, and orient us, because we can no longer rely on sort of an all-pervasive civilizational ambiance, where say we would take for granted, right, that there is divine providence. All things are guided by that principle, and we have channels to the divine, and we're able to live in such a way as to be in harmony with it. If that isn't taken for granted, then we need explanations. Then we need to be introduced. Then we need all of these. I don't want to see there are human contrivances, right? But there's also that pure nectar, which is given to us, which descends from heaven, from from the very essence of things. Initially it's tacit. Initially it's not expressed, but then it kind of is born forth into expression, right, as the logos speaks itself, right, into history, right, and in a way that's really what the perennial philosophy. I almost prefer, people use different terms, right? Philosophia perennis. Some people said religio perennis. I tend to like Sophia perennis, right? The perennial wisdom. And if anyone, viewers of a or listeners of a Christian background may be familiar with the idea of sort of wisdom from the book of Proverbs, right? Or the conception of Christ as the logos, right? Which is to say, because through the logos all things are made, and it's through him that all things come to be known, right? It's not embedded in the very structure of knowledge, is that logos, which Augustine, for instance, evokes as Christ the teacher, right? So later referred to as kind of divine illumination. But it's generally not recognized. It's sort of, as I say, it's implicit, and then our great good fortune, right, as rational beings and as intellectual beings, right? We have this this noetic faculty, the nous, which is not cerebral, but it's more kind of really the heart of us. Our whole being hangs on this, and that is the faculty of illumination. That is the faculty that enables us to open ourselves to the word speaking itself through us, which is really the thread on which the entire cosmos hangs, right? And so really the end of every religion, every tradition, and any of the rays, right, that the supernal sun shines forth with, right? We have to follow them back to their source. So you may be familiar with kind of this idea that all beings, and this is maintained by St. Thomas, for instance, that kind of the beatific vision, right? That is the proper end of man. And sorry to go back to the there's this term, the let's see, I think it's the logos spermaticos, or the semini verbi, that kind of, it was understood by the church fathers that all of there were many pre-Christian philosophers, wise men, who kind of there were the seeds of the logos that would kind of, and so in a sense it's rooted partially in that, and also partially in another conception, which is the Prisca Theologia. And we can kind of go into some of those things. But if you were to, since you bring it up, I mean, what would you understand by the term perennialism?
Well, I was just going to ask you about the Prisca Theologia, which is pretty much the spiritual framework from which all systems of belief are descended. There's some kind of transcendental good that emanates all of that is real, all of reality. I take this concept from Sufi, from Islamic theology, and in a sense it makes sense for all other religions and all other traditions, because you see there's kind of a similar story. There's some kind of similar system in which they have this knowledge of the true, the beautiful, the good, have to be mediated by a priestly caste or a priestly class, and people are bound to know about the true, about this tradition, but they have to learn from the ones who know more than them. And this is something that is repeated in pretty much every tradition. So in the perennial framework, you see, all traditions happen to have these same similar ideas and the same similar models and systems and methods, and so there must be something true to all of them. And what is true is there is a transcendental one from which everything comes from which knowledge itself comes from. There's a way, there's some path towards it that makes people to understand what tradition and what reality and what the being itself is. And well, in the perennial philosophy, you have this way of comparing religions in order to understand and to see how each of them kind of gets to the same point. And so most of the traditions for the perennial school, they are just different paths towards the same goal, which is to have an understanding of God, what the Eastern Christians, the Orthodox, call theosis. Well, that is actually a manifestation, to have some kind of participation in the divine, which is pretty much the same main game for all religions. There's no religion that tries to keep you out of participating from the divine. And this is something that is very interesting, because in some of these traditionalist groups, especially in Christian and Islamic religions, you see there's some kind of interest to keep the tradition to that very group in a very sectarian way. But in the end, even if you try to abide to a particular religion, there are other religions and there are other traditions that try to make the same, and they try to make you participate from the divine. And there are different paths, some which I think are the best. For instance, I think that Catholicism, I think that Christianity are the best paths to participate in the divine, but other religions will say, no, our path is the best. But they are still the same path. They try to get you to the same point, and they try to make you worship. They try to create a community out of the common worship. They try to create an ethical system for you to be good, to do something beautiful, to be true to your principles, and so on and so forth. And all of these elements, which are the perennial tradition, they're simply a framework in which you can understand all of the religions and the traditions in the world. And this is something that I don't know why, but in the West, they kind of see it as some kind of New Age belief. I know, because there's a lot of interest in Hinduism and Buddhism and even Islam in New Age circles. But this is something way different and way more important than just some kind of pop worship. You can try to see how there are these TikTok girls who talk about mantras and about chakras and the elements of the Eastern tradition, but it's all of that is very pop culture. There's no substance in what they are talking. But when you study the perennial tradition and the Prisca Theologia and Sophia Perennis, you see there's something of substance in those concepts, that there's some kind of way to guide you towards the divine.
Right, and I think I might have. So that's all downstream, of course, of if you trace it back, you can say, oh, I understand why they might have come to think that. But no, it's the devil's in the details, right? Whether literally or figuratively, because the sort of New Age perennialism, in a way, it has a relationship to the secular, like a secular pluralist view would say that they're all equally false. Therefore, it doesn't matter. It all looks the same to me, right? The New Age would just kind of invert that and say, no, they're all true. But I don't trust any of the the traditional religions at all. Organized religion, which is partially a symptom of the contraction of organized religion, right? Like, organized religions mostly are not. This is not the phase of their health and their robustness that we see, and many people make the mistake. They see the state of Christianity today, the state of Islam today, right? The state of Hinduism or Buddhism or Judaism or any of these, right? And they say, well, that couldn't be right, But they forget, if in any of these, if you trace them back more to kind of some of the great figures in them, then only then can you see it. And if you make it not merely an image and not merely a system that you're holding at arm's length and kind of, but you have to in some way inhabit their perspective, right? And that's really where contemplation, spiritual practice enters in. Not that one has to be some great adept, but right, you have to meditate upon their words and what those words point to, and sort of sympathetically, because it's really attuning you to something that is intrinsic to your own being, right? It's not that there are these separate religions, that everybody has always maintained are separate. That's an academic construct. That's a modern construct of the academic study of religions. They say, well, this is so unconvincing because all Christians will say they have the one true religion. All Muslims will say they have the one true religion. But see, there, it gets to these fundamental philosophical questions, right? What is it for a thing to be one? What is unity, right? What is there are many senses in which you can say that you adhere to the one true religion. I was just reading Nicholas of Cusa's De Pace Fidei, which is a beautiful illustration, I think, of a Christian perennialism, in the sense that he speaks of one religion in many rites, right? But it's only through through human ignorance, the veil of ignorance, right, in which we all live, we come to see only the many. We lose sight of the one. But in every civilization, there have always been figures who oriented themselves to reality, in the deeper sense, not res in reality in the sense of only an empiricist sense, in the sense of sensible, graspable things, right? But kind of to the fundamental metaphysical underpinnings of all experience and knowledge and being, really, kind of at that level, right? At the essence, there can't be two realities. That would be completely unintelligible. So it's only if you consider religions as right, in a sense, human artifacts, right? They're purely cultural constructs, right? If you think that, then you will never, in a sense, it will never make sense for you to see a unity in the myriad forms of religions or traditions, right? But in a sense, you have to pass from kind of and by the way, not of course denying the importance, right? Because that's the other thing. It's not only through ignorance and accident. This is where figures like Kumaraswamy or Geno or Schuon, they would make the point that the plurality of traditional forms is providential, right? That in a sense, these are all channels and saving barks, right? By which the human soul can be ferried across the sea of Maya, right? We're in this predicament. We're in the predicament of the fall or the Kali Yuga, right? We've become estranged from our own nature and from our God, if you will. I haven't used the word God yet because I would include, even non-theistic traditions like Buddhism, because I think the core, they're oriented to the same reality, even though they express it in very, very different ways. I should also just say, right, there's a distinction here too, because there are many scholars of religion and of mysticism today. So there are many ways also to speak of a perennialism or some kind of universal character of religious experience or of metaphysical reality, or right. I mean, one broad distinction, right, would be, in a sense, like you may be familiar with the let's see. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm blanking on the oh, do you know the theologian John Hick?
I kind of know about him, but not that really. I mean, I have heard, I have read things, excerpts about him, but I haven't really checked his work.
Sure. Well, I mean, so he represents for me, in a sense, right? Because like there's he would agree that there's one reality, there's one truth, right? There's one in a sense that all traditions, but like many other, and it's not just him, like many Catholic theologians and scholars of religion and other traditions, it's kind of like they see traditions as the human response to God, right? But generally speaking, what most of them, in a sense, and many inclusivists, that's another, I'm sorry, I'm just throwing the, but like, it's like, you might see your own religion as the one true religion that is divinely revealed, but then you can see all other religions as valid in the sense that they're human responses to God, right? Even if you think their doctrines are false, right? You think that it's in spite of their erroneous doctrines, nevertheless, right? They're an authentic human stretching towards the divine, right? So there's a kind of subjective way of framing it. But then what's distinctive about what's sometimes called the traditionalist school, or the, perennialist school, whatever you want to. It's all, they would insist on the objectivity of it, right? The revelation is divinely willed, right? So it Jesus Christ comes, right, and the Prophet Muhammad comes, and the Buddha comes, and the whole lineage of Hebrew prophets and the rishis of India, right? These are all. See, it doesn't start on the human side, right? Because if you make it start on the human side, it could just be kind of like, so something in our biology, right? There's some impulse that just kind of emerged through evolution or something that we just all share, and that would be a form of like perennialism in a pure, but in an immanent sense, right? You could be a perennialist in that limited sense and deny transcendence, right? Which you can tell I don't want to. I think the crucial thing, however gung-ho or hesitant one might be to affirm the truth of multiple religious traditions, right? Nevertheless, the first thing is you have to. The initiative begins with God. The initiative begins with heaven, the divine. It begins there, and so we have to recognize it objectively and orient ourselves to it, right? And then through that, then we can come to grasp it subjectively, and kind of existentially embody it, and find what it means in our lives. And now I put it in a certain order. Those are both valid points of access, actually, right? But I think you have to have both. If you have only one, it will lead you to a fault.
But you see, there's also in perennialism some kind of particular inclination towards mysticism, because, well, most religions and most doctrines and most traditions, they also create a rational understanding of the divine. And so you have a doctrine in the Catholic Church, you have Islamic doctrine, you have doctrine in the Eastern Orthodox Church, you have Buddhist doctrine, and you have sacred texts, and so on and so forth. But when it comes to actually participating in the divine, you have to feel it. You have to deprive yourself from all distractions and actually feel to participate in the divine, and that's what mysticism is about. And so in perennialism, there's a strong emphasis in that aspect of mysticism, that you cannot understand tradition or religion only by making yourself, by reading, by trying to understand the doctrines of the religions. I mean, you can compare them, but you're not going to understand how different or how similar they are. How is there a unity in religion as a concept and a unity in the one? Or how is there a difference in the ways the different traditions try to make you participate of the one and make you closer to the transcendentals, to truth, to beauty, to goodness. And so, I mean, this is a concept that for me has been very influential in my own understanding of the perennial tradition. But I don't know if that's applied to everything else, because people tend to be very sectarian with their own traditions and with their own religion. So they try to stay in the rational. And no, this is what I think, instead of this is what I believe. Belief is not something that one has to think, but one has to feel. I think that you're disconnected right now. Oh, all right. I hope you heard what I was saying, but I think this is why perennialism is a very mystic school of thought, instead of most rational schools that we have now. I mean, most people who have studied Thomistic philosophy or patristic philosophy, they know that it's very rational. There's a way to understand things by thinking about them, and this is what the method of the Aristotelian method that Thomas Aquinas used for his Summa Theologia and the rest of his works. But when it comes to actually to believe, you have to feel it, and you have to create a sense of it instead of creating a thought and creating a pattern of what belief is.
Right, and I think of something. You may have read some of the philosopher Plotinus. Right there's and this is a motif that you find echoed in Christian tradition, in Islamic tradition, and really very broadly, which is that our reason has its sober modes and its drunken modes, and you need both, right? You must be able to kind of sort of have that rational mode of kind of setting all things in order and thinking clearly and sort of seeing them as at a distance, but you must also have that ecstasy and that sort of taste of something that transcends the capacity of sober reason to order in that way, right? So there has to be, as you use that term, participation, which I think is very important. And in the classical sense, the Platonic sense of participation, it's much more than, I think, what we usually mean by it, right? There's a real partaking of we find it when we speak of partaking of the divine nature, right? In the Christian tradition, for instance. But it really kind of unfolds into a participatory view of reality and life as such, in its many facets. And you also mentioned mysticism, right? And again, here we are at another much debated, and see, because I think that there's one there's one very widespread approach to mysticism that portrays it as anti-rational, right? That portrays it as there's a kind of sentimental. I think, and this historically there was a trend to frame it this way when the study of interdisciplinary, kind of interreligious study of mysticism emerged. I think sometimes there was a it could be to do with kind of a sentimental, framed in sentimental terms, or it could be about strange things that happened to the mystics, right? And it could be, there was this question of, are they just these naturally gifted people chosen by God, graced, and they kind of they suffer mysticism, or is there a systematic transmission of method whereby you're able to induce mystical, which is to say maybe I would say transrational, or at times transpersonal, or in some way exalted states of consciousness, and not only passing states, but kind of a transfigured way of being, right? Which could be kind of disclosed through, say, initiations of various kinds, right? Well, I'm getting, so there are so many ways, and sometimes people, like someone like Guénon, for instance, because he's reacting against a particular framing of mysticism, he would often contrast the initiatic and the mystical. I think that distinction is too stark. I think they are on a continuum, right? The initiatic can be something very particular, but it really depends on how we want to use use these terms. So if you were to say, what is mysticism?
Well, I think that's a very heavy and difficult question, because, well, mysticism is pretty much some kind of human participation in the divine. But I mean, you can also say that thought is participation in the divine. I had this problem when I was younger, in which I didn't understand what priests and holy people said when they were talking about the spiritual. And then I realized the spiritual was the intellectual. There's some kind of intellective capacity, an intellective potential in each person, and when that person is intellecting, so to speak, they are actually acting in a spiritual way. So, I mean, when we talk about mysticism, we're actually talking about participating in the divine. The divine is everywhere. We're just a part of it, but we're actually connecting to that everywhere, to that everything, to that being itself. And so, in order to actually participate of the divine, you have to think about it. You have to have some sense of some intellectual sense that you are actually doing that. You have to. It's not only believe, but you have to reason that you are actually participating of the divine. And so mysticism, in a sense, guides you towards the participation, guides you towards this connection between the godly and the human. And, well, most traditions and most religions, they try to make you participate of the divine, at least symbolically, with some kind of ritual. I mean, in Christianity, you have baptism, you have communion, you have confession in some denominations such as Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy. You have marriage, and so on and so forth. In others, you have the pillars of Islam. You have meditation in Buddhism and in Hinduism. With all of these rituals, they actually guide you towards being able to understand how you're participating in a larger thing, in a larger experience, which is the divine that connects us, and actually that connects us to the one being.
Your viewers may be familiar with the words of Saint Athanasius: "God became man that man might become God." Right? Or Saint Augustine: "God became what we are that we might become what He is."
Yeah.
Many of the fathers say things like this.
Yeah, exactly. Because, well, the problem, and I think that this is a problem of the modern church, is that they have fallen too deep into what's doctrine. They no longer care about the basics of theology. And when we try to study religion, and at least when I have tried to study religion, I kind of put first God as a first principle, and then I try to create a framework for everything else, for reality itself, out of that first principle that is God. Of course, we have the transcendental. So we have beauty, we have truth, we have goodness, but these are only the manifestations of God that we can perceive the best, because they are the best manifestations that God has in reality. And mysticism serves as a way to actually participate in those manifestations.
Right. And I mean, there are so many ways to. So, I mean, I was reading something interesting recently, a treatment of, actually, there's an author called Eugene Webb, who's a student of Eric Vogelin, whom you mentioned. And, he kind of contrasts the Eastern Christian and the Western Christian way of understanding the Trinity, which is very interesting. Sure. And So I mean, I think he would say, why is it that there's been this pervasive tendency to regard it as something abstract and irrelevant to the life of faith, and now he thinks it began with Augustine's On the Trinity, and I don't know if I have to sort of think through it, but because I think there are streams of Western Christianity that have recaptured, but this sense that we participate in the life of the Trinity, right? It's not merely right. There are in the sacraments, in the holy mysteries, a making present of the divine, right? It's not merely a representation or a reenactment. It's not in some. There is really there is a theophany in the encounter with the divine there, and I think that's what the greatest of the mystics always were able to capture. But and it's not to say, because there is a way that you can so there like you can take it into more speculative directions, and this is one of the reasons why I feel a certain affinity with great figures of the great Western mystical theologians like Meister Eckhart and Nicholas of Cusa, because they really have brilliant rational minds, and they kind of stretch them to their furthest extent, right? Until only that which transcends reason can suffice. I think that the reason has to plumb its own depths and its own limits. So only when the rational capacity reaches the end, right? Then it kind of will fall away, recoil from that which is beyond it, and it will receive that light that transcends reason. But an impulse to kind of prematurely not engage in that rational inquiry is very foreign to me. But nevertheless, as you say, the essential thing is to come to really a true participation through one classical schema you made it the Carmelite one of beginning through sort of canonical prayer, right, and through participation in the liturgy, and through personal prayer, and then one begins with sort of concepts, and one meditates, and there's a deliberate kind of reflection on symbols and ideas, or even if for a philosopher, the nature of God and various right and divine things, and the person of Christ, and all of those things. And then contemplation is a gift whereby one is free of images, one is free of any conceptual grasp. There is simply a total receptivity and openness to the divine. There's just seeing, right? The seeing, I'm sure we could. This is one of my favorite things. Look into pre-modern theories of vision, whereby the eyes would kind of emit beams of light and really mingle with the objects of sight. So sight was almost a tactile thing. There's a real intimacy there, right? When we talk about what about the divine, just seeing God, No, it's very near to the mysticism of the bridal chamber. There is a there's a real you know, I didn't expect to come on here and be citing scripture, but you know, the now I see through a glass darkly, but then face to face, right? For now I know in part, but then I shall know even as I am known. Now, what would it be? What would it be to know as God Himself knows us? You know, right?
I mean, the best analogy in here is one that actually compared God, and there's a reason why many of the older pagan gods were solar gods or celestial gods. And so you actually participate in the godly experience when you are receiving the light and receiving the uh, geez, the heat of the divine, of the sun, of the skies. I think that's the best analogy, because most people they understand God as something very otherworldly, very distant from ourselves, but in fact it's everywhere, and the divine is everywhere, because you can actually perceive it just by feeling, by having a sense that it is there. I mean, you know that the sun is up in the sky because you are receiving light and you're receiving heat. That's the same thing with God. You're actually receiving the divine because you're actually participating in reality.
Absolutely, yes. And you know, you put me in mind of a key distinction, right, between symbol and allegory, right? An allegory is when you take something from and this is drawing partially on C.S. Lewis, but you know, an allegory is you know, when you take things from the sensible world, right, and you kind of use them as a token which, right, represents, you know, some abstract idea, right? But you could just put it in ordinary language, right? But you chose to clothe it in this symbol, right? Or sorry, this allegory, excuse me. Whereas a symbol rather, you know, is first and foremost always itself, right? It's irreducible, right? It's kind of there's, you know, it touches on kind of the archetypal in the manner of the forms, right? And so in that sense, I would say, right, we can use the sun deliberately as an allegory for God, or we can enter into a symbolic perspective where it's rather there is some dimension of the principle of all things, right? That you know, what is the sun a manifestation, right? It's not by our artifice, not by our conceit to construct a narrative, right? You know, but rather there's a natural symbolism, and I hope that at some point we can get into that in more depth, because uh, in all the different traditional civilizations, there's a remarkable unity and remarkable parallels, perhaps, of, you know, these symbols like the sun and the sky and many others, that I think all, you know, they all point to the divine. They're all signs, uh, all love tokens from the beloved, as it were, right? Telling us, you know, you're dreaming, you're sort of sleepwalking, you feel estranged, and you're sort of wrapped in your various designs, but you know, oh my beloved, you know, arise, right, and seek that from which you've come. That there, so I think really they're woven into the fabric of reality, and we can, God willing, open our eyes, look upward, and recognize what it is they mean to say to us.
Well, I think that's a great closure to this interview. It's been absolutely enlightening to talk to you today. Well, it's been a very, well, how do I put it? There's been a lot of topics. There's been a lot of reference. It's been very deep. So I really thank you for having come to us to talk to today, and I hope to have you again in the channel soon.
Of course, it's been a pleasure, and as you say, we've only just grazed the surface of things, but I hope that we can return and really go into some of these things again.
Great. Well, thanks again, Brian, and well, thanks to all the people who will see this in a while, because I will have to put subtitles and everything. So yeah, thank you, and see you soon.
Right.
Bye. God bless.